Alright, what's up everybody? Been a minute since I filmed a video not doing a voiceover, so figured I wanted to do this video on certain rules, certain laws of lifting that break. There's a couple other people in the Noble Natty group that have made this video probably 2-3 years ago. At this point, it's been a while, but I figured this is an idea that I've kind of had for a while. I always wanted to make my own, but I don't think I ever got around to it. So I have about 20 things that are supposed like rules or laws or even like little cults within the fitness industry that I kind of don't really follow, and I want to just provide those things to not only show like certain little instances where it might be better to kind of do what you believe to be best, but more so just that you don't have to do what the fitness industry says. I think there's a lot of trends and fads that pop up and people feel pressured to like kind of take part in the shiny new object, whatever method that is, but you don't always have to do that. And it is okay to train the way that you prefer and do what works for you. I mean, ultimately, while people do abuse the whole lifting is individual thing to an extent, I do think it's individual, but like at the end of the day, we're all the same species, right? There are some things that are individual, and there are some things that just don't exactly matter that much, and you can do various different things, and you can kind of pick things based on your preference. So it's not going to be everything, but a lot of things within lifting do come down to preference. With all that being said, let's get into this list. I won't spend a whole ton of time on each one because there are quite a few that I have to go through. I came up with 20. So the first one is I don't rely on measurement. Off to a strong start. I'm a little bit rusty on these videos. I do rely on measurements as much as lifting performance. A great example for this is arm training. So I rely a decent amount on my lifting performance, my progression on paper, if I'm able to add weight, able to add reps week over week, month over month. I use that. It's a good thing to use because it's very simple. You just log what you did in the gym. You just write it down. It's as simple as that. Measurements almost get overlooked, while lifting performance kind of gets put on this pedestal. Like if you don't track your lifts, or you're not progressing every week, you're not training hard, and you're not doing things right. And this gives people, to put it simply, progressive overload anxiety, and they get kind of forced into this mindset that they have to constantly progress on everything, and they try to progress as fast as they possibly can. This leads them to do things like cheat or focus on lifts that have the highest like strength potential and use techniques that allow them to move the most weight, especially progressively over time. So like the barbell deadlift, you can slowly start to use like say sumo instead of conventional. As far as your setup goes, you can use like an Ohio or a Texas bar instead of a regular bar. You can use bumper plates. You can bounce the weight off the floor. Same with bench. You can do the same thing there. You can start to like go into full retraction, use a cue where you're basically pressing into full retraction the entire time. You can use a bigger arch. You can use more leg drive. You can widen your grip. You can bounce the bar. Like all these little things. I've talked about this a million times, so I'm not going to go too in depth on it. But people put performance on a pedestal, and it leads people to have progressive overload anxiety to the point where they start to focus so much on progressive overload that it's at the expense of their technique. When you take something like measurements, for example, measurements get kind of overlooked and almost like frowned upon in a way because people think you're being too obsessive about it, or they're not reliable because it's not consistent. Like not everything has to be perfectly consistent. You just want to get like a general trend of things to see how you're going overall. I'm not saying you have to like increase your arm size every single day, but if you're measuring your arms once a week and like more often than not they're bigger and the general trend line is going up, that's a good thing. I think it also keeps you accountable with your training to make sure your technique is in check, so you're not just moving more weight for the sake of making your training on paper look good. You're actually subconsciously trying to grow your muscle as much as you can, which will keep your technique in check, and I think that's very valuable. The second one I have a little bit more abstract, you could say. I don't really worry about my V-taper. This is something that is kind of against the grain. A lot of people involved with bodybuilding and hypertrophy training care a lot about their V-taper. You can tell because of the huge emphasis on lats and delts that people have. You can tell because of the huge emphasis on that, but also people trying to make their waist appear as small as possible, whether this is like an influencer like twisting during a posing, or like always doing a vacuum pose, or always like trying to make their waist as small as possible by kind of like sucking in their abs. Like there's certain people you'll see that are influencers or just people on Instagram. Their entire page is just them trying to make their waist look as small as they can. And to me, this is almost like you're almost losing sight of what bodybuilding is for the sake of chasing like a genetic aesthetic, I don't know, look. And that is a tricky one for me to accept because it's largely genetic, and I just don't see that much of a use in putting all of your time and energy into making your waist look very small and making it look like you have this great V-taper, because your clavicle width in your waist circumference is going to be largely genetic, outside of some muscle gain obviously in your upper body, which can make a very big difference, but your waist is pretty much what it is. Like, it just is what it is. I don't see a huge need to focus on that. I'd also say that the way you look in a relaxed state is much more important than the way you look in like opposing states. So if you're like up on a bodybuilding stage because you're competing, yeah, you probably have to go for a bit of a different look as far as your posing and your proportions go. But the vast majority of us are training just to look good in our day-to-day life, and we're not posing day-to-day. You're in a relaxed state, so you want to focus on the muscles that make you look big while you're relaxed. You probably would want to be at like a more moderate level of body fat, so something like 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, maybe 20%. It tends to look best in a relaxed state. When you look at those super shredded people with the crazy V-tapers, they look really good on their Instagram and on their social media because they're only posting mid-training session or post-training session when they have a crazy pump and they're shirtless. When you take those same shredded people and you see them without a pump, they genuinely look like they barely lift. And it's kind of sad because if they were just to bulk up a little bit more, they would look a lot better, in my personal opinion. The next one is kind of relating to the last one. I don't care that much about being lean. And this is for two reasons. One, like I just said, I think you look better in a relaxed state. You look bigger when you are a little bit more bulked up. Like you can even see probably now, like I'm just wearing a sweatshirt and a flannel, but like I fill it out a bit more. I look a little bit bigger. I'm not fat or anything, but I'm probably 19, 20% body fat. You can kind of see my abs, but it's nothing crazy. It's probably because I slack on ab training anyways, let's be real. But the main thing with this is, I think long term, hypertrophy training is all about maximizing your progress in the short term and not caring too much about the short term overall look. The thing you want to focus on in the short term is maximizing growth. The thing you want to focus on in the long term is appreciating that growth and revealing it by being a little bit leaner. But that's definitely not a short term thing. Like if every time you bulk you're like, oh well, I'm not lean anymore, I'm kind of sad. Like, yeah, you want to enjoy the gains in the short term, but you don't want that to like override what you're going to be looking like down the road, because I hate to break it to you, but time will always move on. And if you're someone like myself that hasn't been afraid to bulk, like look where I'm at now, because I haven't been afraid to bulk so far in life. So I'm going to look great once I kind of reach like my late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and that's because I dedicated my younger years to just bulking and not being beach shredded all the time. Number 4, this is where it starts to get a little bit more controversial. If I could, like if I had access to everything as far as gym equipment goes, I would pretty much only use machines. And this is one that I've done a complete 180 on since 5 years ago when I was obsessed with power building. I used to fall for the things like, oh, you can't train hard on machines. People that train on machines are just avoiding doing the hard work. And while some people do use machines as a bit of a scapegoat for not actually training hard under a barbell, which is a little bit more like big and tough, right? That isn't the problem. The problem is the person, not the implement. So if you just, sounds crazy, if you just go on a machine and train hard like anyone else would on a barbell, the machine will work just as good, if not better in most cases. So I would only do machines. There are some cases, Alex Leonidas has made an argument where doing like a non-back supported overhead press variation is going to be very good for your shoulder health. Just always having a back support can kind of limit your scapular mobility, and that can probably lead to some issues in some people, as evident, I think, through his experience. But either way, you don't always have to use a machine with back support, but the overall stability from machines, it adds a lot. And of course, there's a lot more that goes into machines than just the stability, but overall, I would pretty much always use machines. And it's because it will give me better hypertrophy, and I'm not addicted to chasing numbers and bigger lifts where I can use more cheat. It just is what it is. So I'd pretty much only use machines if that was realistic, as far as like equipment access goes. I pretty much already only use machines anyways, but not for everything. So the next one, again, kind of controversial. I train my arms with low reps. This is one that people can't seem to wrap their head around because they associate arm training with getting a pump, and you have to do sets of 10 to 20. And I'm not saying that can't work, but when you have the foundational principles of lifts that can be trained heavy and are better done being trained heavy in something like a preacher curl or JM press, I don't see a reason to go lighter. Like a preacher curl is perfectly stable, it's length and biased, you can get away with using heavy weight because of those two things, as long as you build up to it, of course. And it's just more convenient, it's easier. So why not? Just do that instead. Like, I'm not saying I wouldn't do higher rep sets, but they're a little bit more fatiguing in the short term. So why not just do sets of 5 to 7 on preachers and then do whatever else I have after that? It's just, yeah, I'd probably get less of a pump, but that doesn't matter. Next one I have is number 6. I don't care that much about legs. And this is a tricky one because people will make fun of me for this. And they have, and they regularly do make fun of me for that. And it's a tricky one because, like, part of my responsibility, this is getting into my own personal philosophy with, like, being an influencer or, like, being a public figure, I guess. There's 2 ways you can view it. So, one, I could try and fit the mold and be that perfect person that everyone respects. And that's cool and all, but it's also very misleading. Because if you were to take the camera and the account away from the vast majority of all these, like, perfect figures and influencers, a lot of them would do things differently. So part of what my goal is with this channel is just to be a normal person and just be realistic. So if I personally don't want to train legs, but I have that outside peer pressure always coming in at me to, like, oh, train legs, oh, basement, you have small legs, oh, your legs suck. Like, I get where those people are coming from because they see me. They're like, oh, you're a public figure. You should have good legs if you want to be respected. But that's kind of my point, is I want to be realistic because I was sick of having all of these, like, kind of odd, weird little standards that you had to conform to as a viewer. And it's like, I'm trying to be the person that you guys can see yourselves in, not in like not that I'm like a role model or something, but just, I want to be the person that's like, you don't have to do it the same way everybody else does. If you don't care about training legs, like, it's lifting. If you don't have to train your legs. So a little bit more of like a philosophical one there, but I hope that makes sense to you. Next one, number 7, talked about this recently, but I don't always go for deep stretch. People kind of took that video probably out of context a little bit. I think a lot of people just looked at the title and didn't really actually watch the video, but people seem to think that because I said the deep stretch is overrated and people don't know how to use it, it's overall misunderstood. They think I hate the deep stretch because, of course, the internet is the voice of extremes, right? So the thing here, you don't always have to go for a deep stretch. If I'm going for a super deep stretch on everything, that's going to be at the expense of a lot of good lifts. Like, look at the Smith bench, for example. You can't get a deep stretch on that. But it's a good lift. So why should I get rid of that, you know? Like, and then you have to look at it in the context of a program, too. So if I'm doing, like, a super deep dumbbell fly press to start off my chest session, the next lift I do can be this incline hammer strength machine that has no tension in the stretch and that feels weird if you go all the way into the stretch because of the arcing motion. So I don't go for a deep stretch. I should already have lifts that give me a nice deep stretch already, and you don't have to do that every time. Like, I'm sorry, it's as simple as that. So I'm not going to expand much on that because I already have a video on it, but I love a deep stretch, but it's context dependent. Next one, number 8, I don't worry about mind-muscle connection. A lot of people let mind-muscle connection hold them back from progressing, but what they need to realize is that you have to understand anatomy and biomechanics to make sure you have the right setup. And once you have the right setup and you use the right technique, you don't really have to worry about mind-muscle connection. You just have to kind of worry about your form and your setup, and that's pretty much it. If you're not feeling something and you think your form is good and you've never filmed your training, I could not suggest more to film your training. The way a set feels and the way a set looks is very different. So one of the most common pieces of feedback I get when I start working with a client is they'll send me their first clips and they're like, I thought I trained harder than that. And it's not to say that they're not training hard, but they're like, that didn't look as hard as it feels. So I'm like, that's the paradox of lifting and filming your training. And the same thing goes for intensity, and technique. So you can learn a lot from filming your training. The way it looks in the mirror or the way it feels isn't always accurate. So just keep that in mind. Number 9, I recognize my excuses. And this one might seem very simple, but is always a good reminder. And I'm not someone that likes to go overboard on the fundamentals and the basics. Like, I think once you know them, you kind of know them. But we all start to kind of fall back into these very odd excuses, and without the awareness that those excuses are actually excuses, it's very easy to kind of let them override your rational thinking and decision making. So I'm trying to think of an example of some of mine, but like I would have these kind of excuses where it's like, unless I was in like a perfectly energized state, I couldn't lift. So like if I was to, let's say I had a Monday where I have the most work on Mondays because I don't work weekends. So I have a bunch of clients to get back to on Monday. So I'm already kind of mentally drained from doing that. If I had to like do some type of physical labor after that, like go play a hockey game or do yard work or something, then I would like make the excuse that I couldn't lift after that because I wasn't perfectly fresh and it wouldn't be a good session. And it wasn't until I like said that out loud back to myself that I realized that makes zero sense. But in my head, since my body, or like not my body, but my brain is like biased to preserve my own self, it felt like a very valid excuse without actually thinking about it and saying it out loud or writing it down. So being aware of what excuses you have, if you kind of just think about them for a minute, you'll realize they're just that, excuses. So long story short, no excuses, and be hard on yourself. Number 10, I don't care about strength. And this goes in both directions. When I say I don't care about strength, people say, oh, well, you can't get big then because you have to use progressive overload and be strong to get big. Every big lifter is strong. Every strong lifter is big. And while those two things are correlated, I think people are kind of missing the point, whether it's a misinterpretation on their part or I'm not explaining it well enough, which very well could be both or the latter. I would say that me not caring about strength is not me saying it doesn't matter. It's me saying I don't have an emotional reaction to strength in either way. So if I hit a PR, I don't care. If I lose a little bit of strength but things are overall going well, I don't care. It doesn't ruin my day. It doesn't matter. I'm able to see bigger picture. The strength doesn't really matter to me. For me, lifting is a way to build muscle. It's not like the end goal for me. I don't want to be the best lifter there is. I want to have the most muscle I can build, and that is outside of the gym. So I try to take a stoic approach to this, where I don't get too high on my highs and I don't get too low on my lows, but I also don't care in either direction. So if it's a better option for me to stay light on a lift and reduce the weight, or just pick a lift that is lighter overall, I have no problem with that. I have no problem ditching a heavier lift that I'm good at and strong at to use something that's a little bit lighter and maybe more appropriate, or that limits me in terms of performance a little bit more. If it's a better option for growth, I'm fine with that. On the contrary, I am also okay with lifting heavy if I need to. And I also don't care about that. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're someone that uses what I say as an excuse to not lift heavy, you're saying, oh, I don't care about strength, so I shouldn't lift heavy. You're misinterpreting it and using that as an excuse. My whole thing is like, if the most optimal way for me to get a big chest was just to get a massive bench press, like I'd be benching 500. I can promise you that. That might be an exaggeration, but don't tell anybody. You get what I'm saying. I don't care. If I have to lift heavy, I don't care. If I'm not going to care about going lighter, it has to work the other way around. If I have to lift heavy, I can't let myself have an excuse to not lift heavy. And it is what it is. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to take that stoic approach like I do, you can't abuse it. You have to use it properly. That could probably have its own video, but I hope that summarizes it real nice for a shorter segment. Number 11, I don't take pre-workout. And this one's not helpful to anybody, but I'll try and find a good little takeaway here. So as far as pre-workout goes, a little backstory. I've talked about this probably once or twice. I think I have some type of like undiagnosed anxiety disorder or whatever, and I'm very sensitive to drugs, basically. I'm not saying I'm a druggie by any means, but caffeine is a drug, like, to put it simply. So with caffeine, I was able to take it fine with no reaction or whatever for probably a year or two, and then out of the blue, I would just have anxiety attacks or panic attacks or whatever you want to call them every time after I had caffeine. So I was like, okay, well, no more pre-workout. It wasn't until then that I realized how much of a crutch pre-workout was for me, and I had to kind of rebuild my entire motivation to lift again. And it's 5 years later. I haven't had a milligram of caffeine in 5 years now, which sounds insane to say, but I still struggle without that crutch 5 years later. So what I would say is, if you're going to take pre-workout and use caffeine, you don't want that to override your baseline of motivation for lifting. You want that to be a bonus to make you feel better, but if you ever find that you're becoming dependent on caffeine, cut your ties as soon as you possibly can. It's going to suck for a little bit after you stop using caffeine, but you want to use it as like a little bonus, a little boost. You don't want to use that as a crutch, because if you ever have to lift at night, or if you, for whatever reason, develop like a kind of like anxiety disorder like I had, it was probably underlying already. But if for whatever reason you can't use caffeine or whatever, you don't want that to say, all right, well, now you are going to be a terrible lifter because you don't have your crutch anymore. So I don't know, do whatever you want. That's just my 2 cents. Number 12, this one, kind of a hot take. I don't track my protein and I barely eat meat. So people are very obsessed with protein. I personally don't buy it that much, literally and figuratively. When it comes to protein, I do eat a good amount. Like, I'll have probably 120 to 140 grams a day. I don't eat much meat. I probably have chicken 3 meals a week, but other than that, it's plant-based or dairy-based. Like, I eat a lot of Greek yogurt and whey protein and that kind of stuff, but I just get enough to be like an overall healthy person, but I don't stress too much about my protein after that. It's pretty much as simple as that. There's really no major takeaways or anything there. I just thought it would be interesting to kind of discuss my take on pre-workout and protein. Not very insightful, sorry guys. Number 13, I don't let lifting override my life. This is something that needs to be talked about a little bit more. A lot of people are dependent on their addiction or their obsession with lifting to stay consistent and train hard. I think the true discipline isn't that. That's not forgetting about everything else in life to be able to just put all your eggs in one basket, which is lifting. I've been that guy before, and it's cool for phases. It's cool when you're younger and whatnot, but true discipline is being able to turn that on and turn that off when you want to or need to. It was great when I was 18, 19, 20, 21 and whatever, where I had nothing else to do. I was just kind of a lonely guy doing my own thing. I never went to college or anything, and I moved to a place where I didn't know anybody, so that's all I had. So it made a lot of sense for me to just be as good as I could at lifting and go all in on that. And that's what it led to this channel, which is great. Like, I'll never change that, but I am able to maintain that obsession, but turn it off when I need to. So I don't have to always be that person that's letting the gym override the rest of their life. And that's a really nice balance that I have. It's not easy to get to that point, and it's not perfect, but true discipline is being able to shut your brain off and forget about the obsession and the addiction, and not let it be an addiction, but train in the gym like you do when you're addicted to the gym. And that's probably what I'll leave it at. I think that will probably make sense to most people, and I hope that resonates with you. So that's probably what I'll leave it at for there. I would also, okay, so to add to that, no, you know what, I'm just going to leave it at that. Number 14, I don't stress about progressive overload. This one's a little bit controversial, but I think when progressive overload gets put on a pedestal above other variables, that's when it becomes a problem, because you stop enjoying your training, you're too obsessed with PRs, and you're letting that kind of dictate your mood. And if you're that type of person that if you have a bad session on paper, even though you created stimulus, if you let that ruin your day, that's not a good thing for most people. A good way to kind of overcome this type of progressive overload anxiety is to realize that your performance today is indicative of two things. One, it's going to be your physical and mental state right now. It's also going to be the stimulus that you created last session, or lack thereof. So hitting PRs today, like if I was to go hit a PR today, that's not because I did good today. That's because, one, I at least had my baseline of physical energy in preparation for the session. And two, it's because my training in recent sessions has been great. So today is just that showing itself. But if I don't have a good session in terms of like the on-paper performance today, that's either because, one, it's a one-off where I didn't sleep that good or didn't eat enough or whatever, but I could still create a good stimulus. That's just artificially lowering my performance for today. Or if it's from me having a terrible session or being on a bad streak with lifting, my performance won't be up today because I haven't built any muscle from terrible training the past few sessions. But even if my performance is the same or a little bit down, today's a new opportunity to create that new growth and that new stimulus. And just because you haven't seen the results yet, which would be next session or in a couple sessions, that doesn't mean that it was a bad session. I'll leave it at that for this one. Number 15, I don't mind putting some muscle groups on maintenance to prioritize others. One of the problems with specialization phases before you're an advanced lifter is, one, you don't have patience, and that's for good reason, because if you're worried about a muscle not growing, it means that you still have a lot of potential for that muscle to grow. And I find that anytime a beginner or intermediate lifter starts to go into a specialization phase or want to like just specialize in arms or something, as soon as they realize that other muscles aren't growing, which is like a few weeks, they just switch their training entirely, and they can never actually specialize. They're just like, they're trying to play like whack-a-mole, and it just doesn't really make sense. So you just don't really need any specialization phases. It's not till you're farther along in your journey that you can say, all right, well, now I know how slow muscle growth actually happens. So if I miss a little bit of time, it's not the end of the world. I personally don't care that much. I can specialize in other muscle groups. And that's exactly where I'm at now, because I know any lost muscle I can regain very quickly, and I know that the rate of growth that I have isn't going to be extremely high anyways. So I can, even as someone that is obsessed with lifting and loves bodybuilding, I can completely accept that and come to terms with it. And if you can't, it's probably a sign that you shouldn't be specializing quite yet. Next one. Okay, I already covered this one, but I'll skip ahead to 17. So number 17 is I accept my imbalances. The thing about lifting is you never know what lies ahead of you. So if you're a beginner, intermediate lifter that has an imbalance, you just don't know if it's going to exist when you're advanced. And same goes the other way around. You might not have an imbalance now, but it might develop as you start to advance for various reasons. And the thing with imbalances is you kind of want to accept that they're a little bit outside of your control. Of course, there's some things you can do to try and even them out, but what I found in the vast majority of the time, as long as your technique is good, the best way to fix an imbalance is just to train how you normally do and try and grow as much as you possibly can. And that might sound a little bit different than most advice you would hear, like, oh, start with your weaker side, or like do an extra set, or do a few reps past failure on the weaker side, or whatever. And I'm not saying that stuff isn't valid. Of course, it's very individual, so I'm not going to go into specific examples here. But I think part of lifting is like you just have to see what lies ahead and then try and fix it from there, because the chances are fairly high that that imbalance might shrink or go away entirely down the road. And if it doesn't, it is what it is. Like the difference, if you look at like the net difference between, let's say you have a 1/2 inch arm imbalance, the net difference when you have that 1/2 inch imbalance at 12-inch arms versus 18-inch arms is much different. So yeah, just look at it that way. Like if you have a 1/2 inch arm difference and one's 13.5 and one's 14, do you think you're gonna care when you're at like 17 3/4 and 18 1/4, or even 17 and 17.5? Like I don't think you will as much, and it will be a little bit less obvious. Even me, I have it might not still be 1/2 inch. It might be a little bit less now, but it's between a 1/3 and 1/2 inch arm size imbalance, and I really don't care that much. Like yeah, it'd be cool if I didn't, but I've come to accept it, and I just don't think about it at all. It'll maybe be something I experiment with down the road, but for now I couldn't care any more than I do now. Number 18, I find lifting culture boring. This doesn't really have to do with anything training related, but the lifting culture of always doing the same thing everyone else does, always doing the exercise the influencer does, always following the trends that the science says, always listening to the same music as everyone else. I find it boring. Like there's some cultures that are cool, but I just don't think lifting is. I think it's quite boring. I very much so just do my own thing. And I think as far as lifting goes, while we all have that like pull towards like wanting to have a certain community or whatever that you want to be a part of, that's cool. Just make sure it's not at the expense of who you actually are. Make sure you're not becoming like broccoli hair, tatted, dangly earring influencer that takes SARMs just because everyone else is doing it and you want to fit in. One thing that I was able to do for the most part throughout my younger years, this is more applicable to younger guys, is I just did my own thing. And it's good to be an individual. You can kind of think for yourself. You're not dependent on what the industry tells you to do or whatever's popular or trendy at the moment. Just do what you want, and you'll start to kind of build your own identity, become your own person, and you can make your own decisions without feeling peer pressure as much. Kind of a weird one, kind of an abstract one, but I hope that helps. Number 19, I don't follow or care much about fitness influencers. Everyone says you have to kind of find influencers that you like, that motivate you, and try and follow what they do to learn as much as you can about lifting and adopt their style. I just don't care. I did when I was younger, because when you're a young guy, you like that's how evolution works. Like you follow a role model so you can better yourself and become that person, then you can pass that on to the next generation. That's just how evolution works. It's very simple. But a lot of influencers suck, to put it simply, and I just don't think they're worth following. I'm going to leave it at that. Number 20, the last one. I don't think twice about technique or weight resets. I'm always good to reset my technique if it's for the better. I'm always good to reset and lower the weight if it's for the better. This you have to have some self-awareness with. It's the same thing as the point that I talked about earlier with was it the one about progressive overload anxiety? Or yeah, not caring about strength. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So for this one, it's the same exact thing. If you're someone that is on the more timid side and you're kind of looking for excuses to stay lighter, you're worried about mind-muscle connection and the pump and the contraction and the squeeze and all this kind of stuff, you're not going to be able to maintain perfect technique as you progress on a lift. Your technique is going to change as the leverages of the lift change, as you get bigger, as you get stronger, as the weight to body weight ratio starts to kind of close in or one surpasses the other. Your technique just kind of has to change a lot of the time. Your technique, your tempo, whatever it is, and just realize that a lot of the time this isn't necessarily a bad thing. All right, so my memory card ended up getting filled up. I can't remember exactly where I left off, but to finish up my point on technique and weight resets, they toy with people's egos, man. Like, if you want to be a good lifter, you have to drop the ego and understand that sometimes you do have to do a technique and a weight reset. On the other side of that same coin, sometimes you have to understand that your technique is going to change over time. As you become more proficient in a lift, as your leverages change, as you get bigger, as the stability of the lift changes, as the body weight to weight lifted ratio starts to change, things are going to look different. And as long as you aren't abusing the technique just to lift a bunch more weight and changing your technique drastically for the sake of what I just said, you're going to be okay. And your technique will start to change and slowly, potentially deteriorate as you progress in weight and reps. You just have to know when is an appropriate time to reset weight if you need to. You don't have to do this for every lift, but there are going to be lifts where your technique starts to degrade at the expense of so I worded that wrong, but your technique will come at the expense of your progression, and you just have to know when to cut ties and when to do a weight reset. It is normal and it's okay for this to happen, but at the end of the day, your technique can change a little bit, and that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you've made no gains and you're not going to make any gains. If you have, say, a 5% technique deviation, I know it's impossible to quantify, but just for example, if your technique degrades a tiny little bit, but you have a lot of progressive overload, that will override the technique degradation. If you are forcing your technique to suck just to add weight and reps to the bar, you just have to understand the difference between those two things and when the latter is happening, so you can do a weight reset and a technique reset and actually make that lift a little bit more stimulative again. So that's pretty much all I got for today's video. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions or anything to add, let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next one.